Councils and housing associations in England should sell off their most expensive houses and reinvest the money in building cheaper homes. That's according to the think tank Policy Exchange, which has close links to the Conservative Party. It says social tenants shouldn't live in better homes than most people can afford. Critics say the least well-off would be forced into new ghettos. Well, joining me to discuss this a little is Keith Exford, the chair of the G15, a group of London's 15 biggest housing associations, in our central London studio, and Neil O'Brien, director of Policy Exchange, the think tank behind today's report, joins us from Westminster. Gentlemen, thanks to you both for joining us. Keith, first of all, Keith Exford, what do you make of that suggestion?
Well, firstly, I do thank the Policy Exchange for drawing to attention the importance of increasing housing supply. We are the undersupply of housing, particularly in high-price areas, is reaching crisis proportions. So we're very clear that we need to do more to build many more homes for hard-working families. Unfortunately, I think the proposals for disposing of higher value properties is really rather too simplistic on a number of levels.
Simplistic?
For example, many of the homes that we have are now relets when they become available at rents at up to 80% of market levels. Those homes then help us subsidise the building of new homes. To remove those from our housing supply would prevent us from building as many new homes as we're already producing.
OK, Neil O'Brien, it's an on-paper solution rather than a real practical solution, this, isn't it?
Well, it's also a real practical solution. So there are about 2 million families nearly waiting for social housing at the moment, and our proposal would enable the building of enough houses to house another 700,000 of those people who are often waiting in very cramped conditions at the moment. At the moment, yes, housing associations do have the right to sell off some of their expensive social housing, but a lot of them don't, and a lot of local authorities hang on to property that they've had for years. Maybe they bought it when it was very cheap in the 1970s, and it's gone up in value, but they still haven't made the most of those resources. And what we'd basically argue is that instead of giving one really lucky family a really expensive social house, why not sell that, use the money to build housing for 2 or 3 families somewhere else in a more affordable area. And when we've polled people on this, people do think it's fair. About 3/4 of people say that people shouldn't be offered social housing that's more expensive than the average house in their area. So it's simultaneously something that would get more people housed, it would create a lot of jobs, maybe a third of a million jobs, and also it's something that people think would be fair.
I mean, this is at the heart of this, Keith Exford. It's quite hard to justify to people who don't live in those areas why people on social housing can.
Yeah, obviously I can see the public appeal to the Policy Exchange proposals, but I have to say I don't think that necessarily makes them right. We think that there is real value in mixed communities where people can live near to their place of work. There is a little bit of an overstatement, I think, about the nature of those who live in social housing.
But do they really live in mixed communities? I mean, you know, one argument is that it's very unfair for people who live in social housing to have to deal with inflated prices of the shops and amenities that are on their doorsteps.
Well, I do think that the people who are living in affordable housing, and it's interesting that in terms of the number of new benefit claimants, the majority are actually working. Having people living close to their place of work is really important, and often those jobs are in places which are a little more expensive. But I do think that one of the Policy Exchange proposals is to dispose of housing where the value is above median values. Well, we've had a quick look today in my housing association, and that would affect properties in what we would consider to be lower value areas like Croydon and Lewisham. I don't think the capture of this policy was intended to capture properties of that type.
Neil O'Brien, I mean, basically that sounds utterly unworkable.
Well, there's nothing unworkable about this. I mean, you don't get
answer that direction, that point directly then. Well, Lewisham, Croydon, are these the areas you would then clear people out of, essentially?
Well, nobody would be cleared out of anything. What we're proposing is that as the most expensive properties become empty, as people die or they move out...
So you wouldn't move a single person?
So not a single person would be getting moved. No one would be cleared out of anywhere. And yes, there are some expensive social housing in every single part of the country, including the places that have just been mentioned. But what you don't do if you want to create truly mixed communities is to put really poor people, and remember that only about a third of people in social housing are working, you don't put poor people in really expensive areas, because what you then get is parallel communities. What you get is ghettos, effectively, in the middle of the cities. And it's very, very expensive, as you mentioned, for people to live there.
But then the alternative is you just have poor people living in poor areas, and that is a ghetto in its own right.
Well, the point that was just made is a telling one, because what we're not talking about is necessarily just expensive areas. We're talking about expensive social property wherever it may be. And sure, over time, what it probably would mean is that there would be a little bit less social housing in the most very expensive areas. There would be more social housing overall, so more people will get housed. Even in expensive cities like London, there'd be more social housing. But in the very most expensive areas, the Notting Hills of this world, the Mayfairs and so on, there would over time be a bit less social housing. But I don't think that's unfair. I don't think that people necessarily have the right to be housed in the very most expensive areas, even though they do have a right to get a social house. A
last word to you, Keith Exford, then. You're getting the jitters about nothing, really. I mean, it sounds a very sort of slow-paced change, this, if one at all.
Well, I don't think that we're getting the jitters about it anyway, because the fact is that most housing associations are charities, and any suggestion that we should be forced to sell our assets would be a very worrying step indeed. It would be close to nationalisation. But rather, I think that our concern is that whereas there are, of course, a small number of relatively expensive properties, that's not the best way to view the generality of what we do. We work in a variety of areas across the capital and indeed across the country, helping people of all shapes and sizes, and we feel that there's real value in continuing to do so.
All right, gentlemen, thank you both very much indeed. Thanks for your time this evening.
Thank you.
Tougher punishments for owners convicted of dangerous dog offences came into force today in England and Wales. Now, under the new guidance, the recommended prison sentence for people who allow their pet to attack someone in a public place has increased to